We believe we understand professional wrestling. We see the spotlights, we hear the roar, and we accept the theatrical violence of the story being told in the ring. But for one man, the curtain did not simply drop when the show was over. It dissolved. His on-screen stardom was so blinding, so undeniable, that it concealed a truth so dark, so authentic, that it threatened to tear the entire industry apart. This is the story of a man who reached the absolute summit of athletic glory, only to discover that the championship belt he held was not a symbol of respect, but a magnet for bone-deep, visceral hatred. This hatred was not a plotline. It was a poison that corrupted everything he touched, turning every victory into a moment of pure, dangerous isolation. To understand the depth of this darkness, we must first relive the light. It is January 19th, 1997. The Alamodome in San Antonio, Texas does not just hold people, it vibrates with a primal, collective sound. The atmosphere is a cathedral of steel and anticipation, compressed by the anticipation of 60,000 screaming voices. The air hangs thick and charged, carrying the energy of electricity moments before a violent storm. The audience, a veritable sea of humanity, has gathered to witness not just a match, but a coronation, the official dawn of a new era in sports entertainment. This night was meant to be flawless, a moment of perfect synthesis between a performer and his destiny, but that perfect image was a beautiful, terrible lie. The lights of the massive arena shine down, unforgiving and harsh, illuminating the scene of battle. Standing victorious in the center of the ring is Shawn Michaels, the self-proclaimed Heartbreak Kid. His body is slick and glistening with sweat, testament to the grueling violence he has just endured and delivered. He has vanquished the intimidating Psycho Sid in a match that cemented his place in history. Above him, the championship belt is raised, that massive, glittering symbol of power and dominance. This is his second reign, a declaration that he is the undisputed dominant force of professional wrestling's new generation. The crowd erupts in a deafening frenzy. The cameras flash 1,000 times a second, attempting to capture the magnitude of the moment. The announcers shriek into their microphones. This is his kingdom now. This is his moment of absolute triumph. But even as the championship glints in those stadium lights, catching the dazzling glare of triumph, a profound darkness is lurking. The applause is so loud it seems to mask a low, sustained hum of malice that emanates not from the disappointed fans, but from behind the closed doors and hidden hallways of the Alamodome. Because while the fans cheered and the roar filled the massive building, something far more sinister than any scripted rivalry was brewing in the locker rooms and the nearby hotels. While Shawn Michaels stood at the very top of the mountain as the greatest in-ring performer of his generation, recognized globally for his athletic prowess and charisma, he was simultaneously the most hated man in the entire industry. This was the paradox that would define his legacy and haunt his reign. This hatred was not theater. In the world of wrestling, contempt for an opponent, the villain deserving of the audience's boos, is known as kayfabe. It is the business, the performance that sells the tickets. Shawn Michaels, however, was despised for real. This was authentic, visceral revulsion, genuinely felt by his peers. It was a burning intensity that utterly transcended the carefully constructed boundary between performance and reality. Wrestlers who had spent their entire lives training, sacrificing everything, paying their dues through years of hard travel and low pay, would utter his name with raw venom. Some of them harbored such deep contempt that they truly could not bear to be in the same room with him. This genuine bone-deep hatred was born from years of accumulated grievances. It was the residue of countless episodes of backstabbing, the arrogant dismissal of veterans, and the systematic abuse of power. This is the core enigma of the Heartbreak Kid's reign. A man at the absolute zenith of athletic achievement, yet completely isolated, an outcast among the very peers who shared the trenches with him. He was a figure so reviled that his mere presence in a locker room could generate a tension so thick it felt palpable enough to cut with a knife. The question haunted every moment of his success. How did this happen? How did the greatest performer of his era become the most genuinely despised man? To understand this catastrophic fall from grace that happened even as he ascended to glory, we must trace the arc of his career. A path that soared to the heights of championship glory while simultaneously descending into a personal nightmare of his own making. Shawn Michaels did not begin his journey in the World Wrestling Federation as the villain despised by his contemporaries. He arrived as a supremely talented, hungry young wrestler, possessing a rare, undeniable combination of natural athletic ability, raw charisma, and an intuitive understanding of crowd psychology that immediately separated him from the rest of the roster. The promise of superstardom was there from the beginning, shining like a beacon. But somewhere along that accelerated path to the very top, something shifted dramatically. Perhaps it was the sheer speed of his ascension, bypassing the established hierarchy and traditions of the business. Perhaps the nature of the industry itself was changing profoundly, with the collapse of the regional territorial system concentrating all the best talent in one company, creating a pressure cooker of competition and envy. Or perhaps, more simply and tragically, the blinding light of success revealed a ruthlessness in Shawn Michaels' character that had always been simmering beneath the surface, an overweening ego, a need for control, and a willingness to do whatever it took to maintain his precarious position. Consequences be damned, the only thing that mattered was staying on top. By the mid-1990s, the mechanism for this ruthless ambition was fully formed. Shawn Michaels had aligned himself with a highly secretive and incredibly potent faction, known simply as the Kliq. This was not a wrestling stable that fought in the ring. This was a backstage unit, a cabal that included Michaels, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, and Triple H, among others. The sheer, almost unprecedented level of backstage power wielded by this group was terrifying to the rest of the locker room. They did not merely influence the creative direction of the company, they effectively controlled it, creating a chilling atmosphere of fear and resentment that would define the era. The Kliq's power was absolute, touching every aspect of life in the Federation. They were the puppet masters, making career-altering decisions that affected every single other wrestler on the roster. They were the unseen hand that determined who won matches, who received the career-boosting push, and conversely, who would be professionally buried and discarded forever. This was the core of the bitterness, the source of the paradox. The man celebrated as the best by the world was simultaneously feared and detested as the ringleader of a corporate gang. But what happened when this kind of unchecked dark authority met the old-school integrity of a legend like Bret Hart? The stage for an industry-defining war was set, and the casualties were about to pile up. They say that power doesn't corrupt. It merely reveals. If that is true, then the meteoric ascent of Shawn Michaels to the summit of the World Wrestling Federation revealed a terrifying ruthlessness that infected the entire company. After establishing his position, Michaels surrounded himself with the instruments of his dominance, a select group of friends known simply as the Kliq. This faction, comprised of Kevin Nash, Scott Hall, Triple H, and Michaels himself, was not a stable built for television rivalries. It was a shadow government, a deep state operation within the wrestling business. Their goal was not just to win championships, but to control the creative narrative, the financial opportunities, and ultimately, the careers and livelihoods of every single person who stepped inside the ring. This unprecedented backstage control created an atmosphere of paranoia and fear, fundamentally poisoning the well of the locker room. The Kliq's machinations extended far beyond simple influence. They made decisions that affected the entire roster, operating with the surgical precision of a corporate coup. They determined who would rise and who would fall. They decided who won matches, who received the career-defining push from management, and who would be ruthlessly buried left without hope or upward mobility, and eventually discarded. This was the power of life and death over a wrestler's professional existence. Bam Bam Bigelow, a veteran of the business, would later describe those days as the darkest in company history, claiming that the Kliq had absolutely no respect for anyone else. They would toy with people and ruin so many lives without remorse or hesitation, demonstrating a cold, calculated cruelty. Their actions were a stark, brutal rejection of the traditions and unspoken code that had governed the industry for decades. This concentration of power set the stage for the conflict that would define the entire era. The clash between Shawn Michaels and Bret the Hitman Hart. Hart, who embodied technical excellence and fierce professionalism, found himself repeatedly and perpetually at odds with the leader of the Kliq. Their rivalry was legendary, originating not just from competitive jealousy, but from fundamental philosophical differences about the very essence of professional wrestling. Hart believed in the sanctity of respect, the necessity of paying your dues, and upholding the time-honored traditions that had slowly and carefully built the entire business. Michaels, conversely, championed innovation, pushing boundaries, and doing absolutely whatever it took to make himself the biggest, most undeniable star possible. Two visions for the future of the industry were locked in mortal combat. However, the professional rivalry soon metastasized into something far more personal, far more toxic, and fundamentally cruel. Michaels, armed with a sharp, unfiltered tongue and a complete disregard for boundaries, began to cross lines that, in the deeply private and insular world of wrestling, should never be crossed. He started making shocking public insinuations about Hart's personal life on live television, injecting baseless claims of improprieties that had absolutely no place in professional discourse, even within the context of a wrestling storyline. The escalating tension between them became so thick and volatile that it seemed tragically inevitable that their conflict would eventually end in physical violence or permanent, irreparable estrangement. The war with Bret Hart was the public manifestation of a deeper internal rot. Yet, it was not just the established main eventers like Bret Hart who suffered the stinging barbs of Michaels and the heavy weight of his backstage control. Many others felt the destructive reach of his influence. Enter Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, a rising star possessed of a once-in-a-generation charisma and undeniable popularity that seemed destined to transcend the wrestling world itself. This meteoric ascent, which threatened to eclipse everyone around him, immediately put him directly into the Kliq's crosshairs. According to accounts from those who witnessed it, including Bret Hart himself, Michaels and his allies viewed The Rock's rapid rise with a dangerous cocktail of envy and outright fear. Driven by this envy, the Kliq launched a campaign to derail his momentum, doing everything they possibly could to prevent him from becoming the mega superstar that his talent and charisma clearly destined him to be. They actively attempted to strip him of titles and hand them over to other wrestlers, effectively using their power to suppress his talent. But what truly solidified The Rock's lifetime contempt for Michaels were comments made about his family, particularly about his grandmother. The Rock never forgot this unforgivable transgression. He never forgave Michaels. For years afterward, The Rock would pointedly refuse to work with Michaels. His public disdain was a powerful, silent rebuke that spoke volumes about how the new generation viewed the Heartbreak Kid's character and his twisted priorities. The Rock's experience, while highly significant and visible, was merely one chapter in a much longer and profoundly darker story. Shane Douglas, another highly talented wrestler, found himself tragically caught in the machinery of the Kliq's suffocating influence. He watched helplessly as his career stalled and ultimately collapsed under the heavy, relentless weight of backstage politics. Douglas eventually came to the painful, cynical belief that Michaels had actively sabotaged his opportunities, using his unchecked power to ensure that Douglas would never rise above mid-card status and pose a threat. The pattern was clear. If the Kliq did not approve of you, your ceiling was determined not by your talent, but by their spite. Chris Candido, another promising wrestler who fell victim to the Kliq's sinister machinations, developed such intense personal heat with Michaels that it ultimately drove him away from the World Wrestling Federation entirely. Even established veterans felt the sting. The honky-tonk man, observing the chaos from the sidelines, came to view Michaels as a charlatan, claiming he had only survived due to his status as Vince McMahon's favorite boy toy. Furthermore, he accused Michaels of frequently faking injuries to avoid doing jobs, wrestling terminology for losing matches, to wrestlers he arbitrarily deemed beneath his elevated status. This culture of fear, favoritism, and professional sabotage defined the mid-90s locker room. Yet, perhaps the most telling reaction of all came from The Undertaker, a man universally respected throughout the industry for his unshakable professionalism and his unique willingness to put over talent regardless of the circumstances. If Michaels could lose the respect of The Undertaker, the moral compass of the locker room, his behavior had reached a critical, unsustainable level. As the years progressed and Michaels' attitude became increasingly erratic, fueled by the demons of drug addiction and the corrupting influence of wielding such backstage power over the careers and livelihoods of his peers, The Undertaker reached a painful breaking point. The man who rarely broke composure began to openly and publicly question Michaels' reliability and his very character. The contempt held by the veteran was astonishingly raw. The Undertaker admitted that he harbored such profound dislike for Michaels that he would have stood aside and simply allowed others to inflict violence upon him. The tension culminated in one of the most infamous backstage threats in history. The Undertaker later threatened to tape his fists and beat Michaels senseless if he did not do the right thing, meaning cooperating and losing cleanly in their upcoming match. This was not a storyline. It was a desperate act of intervention by the locker room's most respected figure against a man whose ego had become a threat to the stability of the entire company. The king was still on his throne, but the foundations were rotting beneath him, and the rest of the kingdom was plotting his violent, inevitable downfall. The reckoning was coming. The paradox had reached its boiling point. Shawn Michaels stood at the apex of professional wrestling, the undisputed champion, yet he was surrounded not by allies, but by enemies. The fear and resentment sown by the Kliq's years of dominance were ready to bloom into open warfare. The locker room was a ticking time bomb, and the most respected figures in the industry, from Bret Hart to The Undertaker, had reached their limit. The question was no longer if the kingdom would fall, but how violently. The answers came in a flurry of broken relationships, physical altercations, and emotional devastation. The man who had been the biggest star was suddenly, terrifyingly, alone, facing the consequence of years of hubris, ego, and betrayal. One of the most profound betrayals involved the man closest to him, Marty Jannetty. Jannetty was Michaels' original tag team partner, his friend from the famous Rockers era. Their real-life fight became the stuff of wrestling lore, a physical altercation that represented something far deeper than a mere disagreement between colleagues. It was the visible, physical manifestation of all the resentment that had been building up. All the feelings of betrayal and disrespect that Jannetty harbored towards someone who had once been his closest ally in the business. After that brutal fight, something between them broke that could never quite be repaired. Jannetty's career never truly recovered from the split, and the wound would never truly heal, symbolizing how Michaels would sacrifice even deep friendship for professional gain. The contempt for Michaels crossed generations and even reached those who had once idolized him. Wrestlers like Shane Helms, who had grown up watching and idolizing Michaels, soon discovered the harsh truth. Meeting your hero is not always the joyful experience you imagine it will be. Helms came to believe that Michaels actively resented the very admiration that Helms had harbored for him. Rather than being pleased or grateful for the respect, Michaels seemed to view it with nothing but outright contempt, a disdain that baffled and wounded his younger peers. The situation became so tense that Helms would later claim it took everything within him not to physically strike Michaels during various situations, with only the fear of jeopardizing his own push preventing him from acting on his rage. The tension often spilled over into undeniable violence. Enter Kurt Angle, an Olympic gold medalist and a legitimate tough man, who got into a physical altercation with Michaels backstage. The incident began after Michaels started overselling Angle's offense in the ring, a deliberate act intended to make Angle look foolish and undermine his credibility with the audience. This professional disrespect was the final straw. The fight ended with Angle coming out on top, physically throwing Michaels around the locker room and successfully asserting his own credibility and authority. These skirmishes, though often brief, were crucial. They signaled to the entire locker room that the Heartbreak Kid's power was no longer absolute, and he could now be challenged. Even the veterans who had witnessed decades of backstage chaos viewed Michaels with unparalleled disgust. Jim Cornette, a legendary manager and veteran of the business, looked at Michaels with pure disdain. Cornette publicly recalled Michaels as being one of the most unprofessional wrestlers of all time, a man who possessed no respect for anyone, even those crucial figures who had helped build his career. Cornette offered a cynical, brutal explanation for the final change in Michaels' life.